Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leading on the Edge of Crisis. This webinar is the third in a series of webinars as we celebrate 25 years of RLE, Resilient Leaders Elements. 25 years into helping people reach their leadership potential. 25 years into helping leaders acquire clarity of direction for the journey they're on, awareness of themselves, others, and the environment, build resilient decision-making skills that are robust and versatile, and have leadership presence that is authentic, serving, and intentional. I'm Amine. I'm an accredited consultant with Resilient Leaders Elements, a faculty member in Human Resource Management, and head of Library Information Systems at Notre Dame University in Lebanon. I'm also a doctoral thesis supervisor at the University of Bath in the UK. I'm truly delighted to be your host for what promises to be a timely and thought-provoking conversation. Crises, whether global, organizational, or deeply personal, test leadership like nothing else. They push us to the edge of our capabilities, our plans, and sometimes our patience. But they also reveal what leadership can be: agile, purposeful, human, and deeply resilient. Having been in Lebanon during the past crises, from economic collapse, currency devaluation, port explosion, COVID, and most recently, an all-out, life-threatening war, I can say that my definition of resilience and resilient leadership comprises a lot of versatility, self-awareness, having a lot of clarity and determination despite the blinding fog at times, yet remaining serving and authentic. Today, we're joined by three remarkable leaders who have navigated turbulent times and will share their experiences, observed challenges, lessons learned, future prep, and insights on how to lead when the ground is shifting beneath our feet. To begin, I'd like to invite each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves. Tell us who you are, what you do, your definition of crisis, and maybe one leadership value or principle that has guided you during a time of crisis. Let's start with Claudia, then we'll move to Caroline and Alison.
Thank you, Amine. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, and I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm Claudia van den Heuvel. I'm a director in PwC's Crisis and Resilience team within the risk line of service. And I have been here 10 plus years, and I've always worked in crisis management. My background is in the psychology of crisis decision-making. And what I'm most passionate about is supporting current and future leaders in their ability to elevate their own personal and their team's collective resilience so that they can navigate crises more effectively. I'm all about the behaviors, the skill sets, those personal things we can do to manage our own energy levels so that we can think more strategically, make more agile and effective decisions under pressure. Amine, you asked what my definition of crisis is. I do tend to defer back to the ISO one. So I always think about any event that threatens the strategic viability of an organization and requires true agility to respond effectively. And as I've said before, or as I'm indicating, plans don't manage crises, people do. So I always take the people lens to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Caroline?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks, Amine. My name's Caroline Field. I'm a partner at PA Consulting and I lead their resilience practice. I'm also a Royal Academy of Engineers visiting professor at Loughborough University in Structure and Infrastructure Resilience. And I'm also the co-founder of the Centre for Whole of Society Resilience, which is kind of research practice policy to deliver whole society resilience. I'm also a resilient leaders consultant, and I'm working towards my ICF coaching accreditation. I would consider myself, I guess, a resilient leader, but also a leader in resilience. I like to kind of work on the standards and the approaches for kind of building resilience within the whole system. I'm passionate about joining dots up. So I very much see resilience is about bridging those silos. You can't be resilient in a silo, and being able to kind of pull together and understand those interconnections. And I spend a lot of my time helping clients essentially understand and target where they need to invest in resilience. So maybe of their organizations, it could be of a community, it could be cities. I've done quite a lot of I started my career in engineering, as I mentioned, and so I spend a lot of time designing resilient infrastructure and buildings, if you like, from extreme loads like earthquakes and bomb blasts. So that was where I started my technical career. But during that, the last sort of 15 years, really broadened into sort of systems thinking, and so the resilience of cities, the resilience of communities, the resilience of organizations, and now the resilience of the individual, because that really is at the heart of all these systems. And so I'm really kind of passionate about that sort of whole system approach, and being able to understand how targeting the individual and building individual resilience really helps that kind of propagation of sort of national resilience. So I'm not going to give you a definition for crises, but I will give you a definition for resilience. So resilience is that capability to prepare for disruption, adapt in a timely manner, and thrive in a changing environment. And so I spend a lot of time trying to get my clients to the kind of proactive stance, so they're not dealing with crises all the time. So I spend most of my time in that space of kind of how do we get more proactive, more strategic. So thinking about where we need to invest in building capability. And those capabilities might be to withstand, absorb, and bounce back from a specific crisis, reducing the time it takes to recover from a crisis. And then what we're seeing more and more, and I'm sure we'll get into, is that ability to adapt to changing conditions, because it seems like it's so volatile. We're just constantly doing that. So that adaptability and adaptive capacity, I'd say, is one of the most important things, as well as being able to really learn and improve from each experience.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I think lastly, I'll just say I'm working at, I've mentioned all different levels of the system, so tend to work on national resilience, but also kind of critical national infrastructure organizations. So very much in the sort of developing leadership and culture to embed the right kind of behaviors and thinking, but also being able to prioritize where to kind of build capabilities before bad things happen. Thanks. Great to be here.
Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. Alison?
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. And delighted to be here today as part of this panel, which I think will be a fantastic conversation about crisis and leadership. So I'm Alison Lawrence. I'm a leadership executive coach and mentor. And this comes from sort of over 30 years, I hate to say it, over 30 years, working in public affairs and patient access in the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector. And what I mean by that is basically working on initiatives, advocating for managing systems and processes to ensure that people like us, like our families, like our friends, people we work with, get access to the right treatment, the right care at the right time, and really making sure that the patients get a good outcome and they get what they need to deal with their health issue. Now, I'm specifically here in the context of crisis because of my experience looking back on the number of crises and the various crises or issues management, sometimes it gets called, in my working life. But of course, everybody has we have our own moments, undoubtedly. But my specific experience comes predominantly from the vaccines and immunisation space, a number of things like MMR, flu vaccine supply, issues around safety and quality of actual syringes and needles and all those sorts of things. But most specifically, I was a member for 10 years of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, and was there before, during and after COVID-19. And so I was part of the committee looking at and shaping what the vaccine response was for the UK, which brought enormous insight into working at a national level in a crisis situation. It was both humbling, exhausting. It was fascinating. I met some incredible people during that journey, and I'm actually very proud personally of the contribution that I was able to make, albeit relatively small in the grand scheme of things for COVID-19. You asked about sort of what the definition of a crisis is, and I always like to define a crisis about what it's not. What it isn't is business as usual. It's something that is not planned, it is unexpected, it might be a surprise, it might be something that's a planned surprise, but it's something that takes us away from or requires us to respond and act and work in a way that isn't our usual business day-to-day process. So for me, it's about something that it's what it's not business as usual. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for those introductions. Your perspectives already set the tone for a rich discussion ahead. Looking forward. Let's dive in with our first question, which ties back to something many of us have wrestled with recently. And for that, I'm going to be asking Claudia. Claudia, do we actually learn from crises, or do we just bounce between panic and relief? In other words, how can leaders stay focused on the bigger picture, stay strategic, and use uncertainty as a chance to grow, not just survive?
Thanks, Amine. I love the way you phrased that, following up from the conversations we've had together, because I believe it was Jim Yong Kim, the former president of the World Bank, who actually referred to the world being stuck in this cycle of panic and neglect when he was describing our response to COVID. It's so interesting to me because one element of my work here at PwC is essentially conducting post-incident reviews. So we get called in to support organizations after they've experienced a serious incident or crisis, to really understand how did the crisis occur, what were the root causes of the crisis, and then how was it managed, and where were sort of the gaps or the lessons learned, so that they can improve their resilience capability. And they are absolutely one of my favorite type of projects to do here at PwC, because you really get to dig into the DNA of an organization and examine the leadership presence, the decision-making, all of those behavioral factors that were almost under a spotlight because of the pressures that these teams or leaders are operating under. And you really can inform some very strategic changes that organizations can make. And personally, if you look outside and see just how many incidents or crises are occurring pretty much consistently now, I'm surprised we don't get called in to do more of these types of reviews. One notable example that one where we did one was the Health Services Executive in Ireland. This was a few years ago. They suffered a catastrophic ransomware attack. And Alison, I'm sure you'll know all about this case study because the impact on patient care was phenomenal. And they actually asked us to do the deep dive review, and then they published the 200+ page report on their website so that others could vicariously learn through them, which was really positioning them as sort of industry leading, even though they knew they had suffered sort of vulnerabilities in-house that allowed the ransomware attack to occur. So I thought that was a very courageous thing to do. Now, why aren't others organizations doing this? Because this concept, this old adage of don't let a good crisis go to waste. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's so true. Yes, crises present risk. Yes, we have to manage the disruption. There's a lot of challenge, but they do also offer a huge opportunity, because within crises, organizations are really we have to challenge outdated assumptions. Crises foster really good collaboration and very fast decision-making. And they allow us to implement transformation quickly, right? All of a sudden, all of that red tape that seemed to matter so much before the crisis happened, it fades away. So organizations should really use crisis to accelerate transformation, rather than sort of managing disruption, right? And that will create competitive advantage. If you look to have managed a crisis well, you'll be really attractive for partner suppliers and investors because you build trust among your stakeholders. Easy example, of course, again, coming back to COVID, is that rapid deployment of the mRNA vaccine technology. But crisis is not a comfortable place to be for leaders. So I think if we're going to maximize this opportunity that's afforded to us within a crisis, we need leaders who, one, really embrace uncertainty, two, are willing to seek expert input really widely, so flatten the hierarchy and just get the right experts in the room together, and foster that very fast learning culture. Ultimately, when you're managing a crisis, you will make mistakes while you're trying to figure out the best solutions for something. And if you or your team members get slammed for those mistakes, you won't be willing to take risks in the next iteration, right? So having that comfort with failure and really fast learning, both within the crisis and then learning from the crisis, it requires this real shift in mindset, I think, for many leaders. And it's, to me, it's that cultural shift, right? How can we embrace uncertainty, and how can we actually implement that sort of culture, I guess, of continuous learning and adaptation so that we make the most of it?
Great. And as you've said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. I think we could use this pretty much here in my context. Frequent use of this, considering the many crises that we've been through. Alison, what do you think about how Claudia put it in her context, and what could you add?
So it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because as you were talking, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And as you were talking, I was thinking about our personal behaviours and how many times have we all gone, oh, I'll not do that again, or that's a life lesson or whatever, and then oh, there we go, and we repeat it. But on a sort of a more serious note, and I think about the context of JCVI and COVID and 19, and that COVID-19 inquiry is still ongoing in the UK. Where are we, 2025? And my concern, or my observation, I think, about learning from a crisis is sort of yes and no. I think there's some big ticket obvious stuff that organisationally and team-wise and individually we might well pick up and run with quite quickly. There might be a process or an infrastructure that needs change. And I guess some of that sort of digital impact, like, what M&S have gone through recently, I suspect there's some real lessons immediately that get picked up. But my concern is always that those sort of perhaps more subtle, more behaviours, some of the sort of smaller things that are not less important but might be a bit smaller, I think we always run the risk of forgetting those, or they get a little bit lost. And I think it requires a sort of an active, I must remember to learn those lessons and keep a note of them and put them in. But it's a continuous work in progress, I think.
Thank you. Caroline, I think you have something to add there.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, I think what others have said has been really, really on the money. I think I can probably just add something on the strategic part of your question. So what I'm seeing, I suppose, with clients right now is they just seem to be constantly firefighting, and so constantly lurching from one kind of mini crisis to the next. And so with rarely having kind of the time and space to kind of stick their head above the parapet and think a bit more strategically and kind of bigger picture, and really sort of try and chart that course towards a better outcome, if you like. And that's really what we want from our leaders, is to be not just dealing with these challenges, but actually proactively charting that course forward. Yeah, that seems to be the perennial challenge at the moment. And so I've seen some kind of move towards almost separating some functions in resilience between those who respond and those who actually set the strategy. So that is one way of doing it, just to try and, I think, reset that balance, because at the moment the balance just seems to be quite out in terms of, because there's so many things happening all the time. It's just having that headspace and the resources to actually be more strategic. So I think in the short term, I'm seeing that sort of separation of strategic function from response function, but I think ultimately they'll need to come back together.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. I'd like to remind our audience that the chat service is open, so please send your questions or comments, and we'll make sure to respond to all of them after this session. We'll also make sure that this recorded session and the answers to your questions will be available to you to watch again. My second question is for Alison. So what does it take to lead ourselves and others through repeated crises? In other words, especially when you've just stepped in or inherited a team, what makes it possible to quickly build trust and collective resilience? And here I'm referring to, for example, what if COVID hits again? What if we go through that turmoil all over again, a repeated crisis?
it's a really good question, isn't it? Because I think if any of us have been through a crisis in any shape or form, you sort of get through to the other side and you go, oh, thank goodness that's over, and go and have a little lie down or go and have a cup of tea and carry on, and then don't think about the next one coming through. So I think it's a really, it's really important to know that crises will come and go. That is the nature of it. And if we look at, pandemics, there was a flu pandemic not that long ago, before the COVID pandemic, didn't really grab the headlines and make such a big impact because actually flu is quite normal for people. People are familiar with flu, but these things happen. So there will be, another virus related pandemic or another health pandemic in some form coming up. And of course, to live on adrenaline the whole time and sort of think, oh my goodness, any moment now this is going to happen, is not helpful. That's not good for your own personal health and well-being. It doesn't help the team that you work with. It doesn't help your business. It's a distraction to the day-to-day and what actually you're there to deliver on a sort of daily or a annual basis, whatever your responsibility is. So the key to it is about being prepared, that preparedness. And we hear that word quite a lot. What have we got in place? And I think what is important is, if you're walking into a new business, or even if you're an existing business, there are two elements, as I see it, very, very simplistic. One is the sort of tools, the resources, the stuff, the frameworks, the processes. Are they in place? Have we got what we might need should something happen? And then the other bit is about our leadership, values, behaviours, the culture that we are going to be creating and working to support, that promotes trust, good communication, clear communication, regular communication. Communication is such an important word and an important thing. Have you got shared ownership and a common understanding of what their goal is for the business on a day-to-day basis? Because that's the foundation from which, when something happens that isn't normal, your base is solid and dependent, and you've got that trust, so that when you step up to lead a true crisis, whatever your role might be in that situation, you can actually get up to speed pretty quickly, and people will come with you, and the business or your organization will go with you. And when I think about this, I really do think about the experience at JCVI. So the Joint Committee, its remit is 3 times a year, 3 days, in effect, 3 days of meetings a year. Very clear agenda, looking at the childhood programme, seasonal influenza, some of the new vaccines and the new viruses and bugs that need to be dealt with. So we went from this nice, calm process. There's a secretariat that provides all the support. Experts come and go to prevent evidence for the committee to consider. Advice, recommendations go up to Secretary of State. All lovely, nice and straightforward process. COVID hit. We met probably on average twice a week. And if you listen to and look at the hearing that is going on, it was 28 pieces of advice or recommendations to the Secretary of State and over 90 meetings in about 12 months. The only reason, as I see it, that was possible was because those two elements of sort of process and infrastructure and sort of clarity was there. The JCVI didn't suddenly change the way it worked. In terms of the Secretariat having experts in, who came, the papers, all those sorts of things that enabled us to review data and evidence and make a recommendation. That continued, that was there. And we had a culture of being curious, good communication, trusting one another about what people's opinions and expertise were around that room, which enabled the committee to go from sort of 10 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour sort of overnight. So for me, it is, if you've got your basics right and really work on both your framework, your process, but also your leadership and your culture and your behaviours, either as a team, individually, as an organisation, then you don't have to live on adrenaline day to day. and you're in a much better place to be able to take forward in a crisis.
Wow. So moving from 3 meetings a year to 3 meetings a week. And despite all that, you made sure that communication channels remained clear and open, and you were all the time communicating. Wow, must have been a big challenge, right? And
It was, and it was an amazing, I mean, you know, it is sort of, when I sit back and look at it, I think, whoa, that was crazy, but it worked because those things were in place.
yeah. And I'm sure when I think of repeated crisis, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is war. And when I think of repeated war crises, I think of what I need to do or what we need to do whenever war begins, whenever war ends, where to go, how to go there, what to take, what not to take, repeated crisis and repeated steps. But every time we learn our lessons. I'd like to actually get a different perspective, maybe from Claudia on repeated crises.
Thanks, Amine. Well, actually, it's interesting to me because often the nature of crisis means that whatever team you're inheriting to manage that crisis, it will be a different one, right? So it might be a repeated crisis, and yet actually the multidisciplinary nature or the impacts caused, etc., means that you're operating with a different team. And just listening to Alison speak there, the piece around trust I find fascinating, right? This is, I think, where leadership presence really plays such an important role, because everyone involved in the crisis has essentially their own role, their responsibility, whether that's clear or not within the frameworks and processes. They also probably have a specific goal or a motivation or at least a priority that they're following. So, you know, can you create a well-operating machine that is built on the basis of trust to manage the crisis effectively? And I find actually it's great to see, it's reassuring to see that the answer is often yes, because I think actually crises almost force us to trust a little bit. We have no alternative than to trust, because there's so much risk involved in that external crisis that there's less risk in trusting each other. And again, sort of that leadership presence piece, right? What's your role in setting that tone, and how do you communicate that? And how do you set a very clear North Star or shared purpose to really bring people together? It also might be, you know, with the 90 odd meetings that the JVI were having, you know, at what point do you start maybe as a leader being very down in the tactical weeds, and then after a while step away? Because that's a real illustration of trust, isn't it? It's a real clear communication of bi-directional trust as a leader. And then you can focus more on being essentially the political leader, looking at more the external stakeholder environment, for example. And also what I find really important, which isn't often in the frameworks and processes, is, do we have someone assigned who's really essentially acting as that devil's advocate in a room? Are we challenging the team in terms of how we're making decisions? Because every challenge presented is going to be new, the problems are going to be unique, and therefore the solutions will too. So do we have a voice in the room that is challenging? You know, are we inviting that contributory dissent to make sure that we're making effective decisions, essentially? Because ultimately, every crisis is unique, I think, and therefore the decisions we make will be different and will be specific.
So make sure that we have a devil's advocate in the room. I like that. That's new. And yet a different perspective from Caroline.
Yeah, sure. I like the devil's advocate. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I would say probably agreeing with Claudia there. So I think my top one would probably be being able to kind of create that alignment, so that sense of purpose and shared kind of direction. I think that's so important to kind of galvanize everybody and get everybody moving in the right direction. And then sort of linked to that is really empowering others to kind of make decisions and play the role. And I think it's much easier when you've aligned people behind that common goal to kind of then sort of challenge them. Well, what can you do to make sure, you know, we're getting to that place? So whether it's during a crisis or during normal times. So I think, you know, alignment, empowerment, and then I think it was also mentioned authenticity. So I think, you know, building that trust, being your authentic self, being kind of aware of others, and having that sort of emotional intelligence to be able to really sort of understand how others are feeling in different circumstances, and being able to really kind of help them through that. So I think those are probably the 3 key things for me.
Wow, great. Thank you. And we'll move to our third question. Alison, do we need to rethink what leadership looks like in a crisis? In other words, from frontline workers to emerging roles, like the recently emerging chief resilience officers. We've been hearing about these new positions. Who's really stepping up, and are traditional leadership styles still working, or do they need an update?
Yeah, great question. I've seen, a number of these chief resilience officer type roles coming up, and I do feel that this is less about rethinking sort of leadership behaviors per se, in terms of building culture and resilience in the organization, good communication, trust, being authentic, etc. All the lovely things that we've talked about so far this morning. But actually, I think it's about that confidence to look at the team, look at the people. You've got a resource in front of you when you've got a resource, and say, who is the best person to lead this issue, which isn't necessarily, so it's unpicking that traditional hierarchy of just because you're the chief or the senior person, whatever the title is, the title doesn't necessarily equate to being the best person to lead in an issue. And actually, I was thinking about a situation I had a few years ago working in-house in a company where there was some challenges around compliance and governance and so on, which was very much an internal issue. And actually, the best person to lead that role and that work was not somebody with a chief in their name. Actually, it was somebody who was able to galvanize, to keep everybody on track, perhaps even be a bit of a devil's advocate and say, why are you going off in that direction? Because that's not getting us to where we need to be. Bringing people back on track, keep holding people to account, making sure they deliver what needs to be delivered on time, providing that support and so on. And they're not necessarily that chief person. And I think the sort of learning, if you like, for organization and teams is to reflect and think about enabling that to happen. So enabling the person who hasn't got the big title, but necessarily they could be the best person to lead, and what do they need to make sure that they get the support and the commitment and have the authority, if you like, in that situation to do it. So the best role that the chief executive could do, for example, or the chief resilience officer, for example, do, is to say, actually, Claudia is the woman for this job. She's going to be the leader on this. You all have to pay attention. This is what we're doing, and actually look to, and sort of almost physically make sure that people go that direction. So it's more about who rather than what your title is and your sort of leadership title is.
And it's interesting how we saw non-traditional leaders emerge during COVID, such as nurses and doctors. They were there to lead, and give advice. Claudia?
I love that. Amine, I think Rachel here at RLE always says everybody leads. And it was so much more obvious in COVID, wasn't it? That the right people, the right leaders that you need are often the ones on the front line. I have to admit, I actually would just have to agree with Alison. I think the critical thing for me for whoever leads resilience is that they have to have that bird's eye view, right? They need to really understand both the technical capability that's required, but also the business disruption that could be caused by various crises, and therefore where you need to actually build resilience in, and what needs protecting and what needs investing in terms of resilience versus those that don't necessarily matter. It's really interesting working with organizations on essentially mapping their most sort of strategic level business operations to understand where they actually need to invest in resilience. And someone really needs to have that end-to-end understanding of how the organization operates and protect that which matters most from any kind of disruption, because you can't predict what might be the crisis that hits you next. We are seeing some really interesting articles about the CEO taking the role of Chief Resilience Officer, because they've got not just that bird's eye view, but also, of course, the way that Alison was describing in terms of really backing resilience, putting it at the forefront of the agenda and of thinking, and embedding it by design from the start. so that it's not just about planning for how do we recover once we've been disrupted. It's all about building it in from the start.
Great. Caroline, have you worked with emerging leaders, or what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so actually, so I mentioned that I kind of work in national resilience. So I've been developing a leadership program for chief resilience officers, specifically for those sort of in charge of the local resilience forums in the country, but also for business leaders. And so it's been a really interesting kind of thinking about, well, what are those skills that are needed? Because I think there's definitely a shift that needs to happen nationally. So traditionally, our local resilience fora have been there to respond to emergencies. But I think now with the UK resilience framework and strategy, we're trying to really shift the dial across to a more proactive stance. So really actually starting to engage with communities and empowering this whole of society approach. So I think that does need a completely different skill set. And it's really going to be about being able to join up the dots, being able to connect, build consensus, build that trust, build that kind of sense of direction, and really kind of listening to the needs of their communities. So I think it's quite a different skill set than responding to a specific crisis, which obviously they're going to need to do as well. But like the others have said, I think they can sort of delegate. It's figuring out who's the best person to do what, but also not just focus on the response part of it, but focus on building up that kind of baseline of community kind of resilience. And the same will be for within organizations. I think really that skill set of collaboration and then actually empowering, people within the organization, like resilience champions within organizations, to actually own the resilience of their department or their part of the business and really understand why that matters and what makes that, what they can do to kind of move that forward.
It must be challenging but exciting to work on a national framework for resilience. You mentioned the UK resilience framework.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to look at that. Yeah.
Oh no, it's brilliant. And it's really great to see, actually, because I think, I think our approach to national resilience, we have the Civil Contingencies Act, is well renowned, but certainly it's always been from a very sort of responding to crises approach. So we're kind of really good at that. We're very good at putting our capes on and our tights and underpants over our tights and coming into respond to a crisis. But I think we need to get much more proactive, because you just can't keep doing that, and we need to try and get ahead of everything. So it's really, I'm really enjoying that shift and that kind of thinking that how do we get us from there, one place to the other. So that's really exciting.
So Caroline, when it comes to building resilience across whole systems, as just you mentioned, nations, whose job is it? Like, how can we build whole system and societal resilience? And what shifts are required in mindset and accountability to make this sustainable? And here I'm thinking about just as you mentioned, nations that face continuous or frequent crises, not just one. Natural disasters, wars, economic crises. So how can we actually build societal resilience?
So that's a big question, isn't it? Well, so I suppose the easy answer is it's everybody's job, and that's basically one of the three kind of themes of the UK government's resilience framework is this, empowering this whole of society approach. So which includes like business leaders, community leaders, individuals, infrastructure organizations. So it's everyone owning their part in that process, which I think is, I think as a nation, we've become quite dependent on the government to fix our problems and not necessarily taking responsibility for things ourselves. And so I will give an example of, I did some work in Beirut, actually, Amine, a number of years ago. I did the urban resilience plan for the city. And what really struck me was the fact that because the governance there was so poor, people did have to own their own resilience. And so they had dug wells in their garden and had their own, electric power sources and what have you. And I was like, well, that's a bit much, but there is definitely a sweet spot here in terms of how we
You've seen solar panels everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. There's a balance to be had, and, and at the moment, because of all the kind of volatility with Russia and Ukraine, certainly our military, as you well know, is kind of investing in building up our societal capability for war, if you like. Which is the same, basically the national resilience is the same thing. It's building up that capacity within the population and within our supply chains, within our communities. That's really what we're on that process, and being able to really take ownership ourselves. And I think the way to do that, I'm just going to plug, we're doing a whole conversation about this next week on the centre around how we communicate and engage with people to get them to own it. Because I think traditionally we've been very much about telling people what their risks are and expecting them to care or do something about it. I mean, people don't care until stuff's happening to them. So I think it's a whole different conversation around, okay, well, what does resilience mean to you in your context? What do you need to kind of, how do you get your basic needs met in the first place? Before you can start thinking about crises, you have to deal with some of these other stresses that go on. So I'm really looking forward to having that different type of conversation, and really sort of getting people to kind of think about resilience in their context and what they can do. And that's the challenge, saying, well, everyone can do something. What can you do? And so I think then that starts building that sort of leadership, the self-leadership that we need throughout the whole system.
Yeah, well, great. Let's see from a medical perspective. How about societal resilience from a medical perspective, Alison?
Well, actually, I was really thinking about Caroline. You commented about that sort of personal responsibility, and I think there is something very much in society about expecting, government, for want of a better example, to sort it out for us. And I was also thinking about being cautious around when we talk about resilience, and thinking about it in the context of a big thing that might happen, a big crisis or a significant crisis. And actually, you're right, it is everybody's job, but actually everybody's job, even from a personal perspective, to look after your own resilience, because on a day-to-day basis, not ending up being burnt out when the pressure is on. It might not be a crisis, but it might be a deadline for your end of year, financial reporting systems, or, business planning, whatever it might be. You could be under a lot of pressure. And actually, what is it that you can do individually to ensure that you get yourself back into balance, that you get back from a sort of a crisis, and you're resilient in that middle, so you can function and deliver and look after yourself, because then you can look after your team and your colleagues and the people you work with. Then you create it's like onion layers, isn't it? Then you create a better environment and a culture of it. So I think it is everybody's job, right from a sort of a personal day-to-day. How am I helping myself to stay balanced? What do I need to do to be resilient and do that? And it will have a knock-on elsewhere.
And from a consulting perspective, Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wanting to build on what Alison's saying. I couldn't agree more. I do a lot of work with teams and leaders outside of the crisis context as well, and just talk about resilient leadership, because there were two new words in the Collins Dictionary a couple of years ago in 2022, which were permacrisis and polycrisis. So we're essentially all, as leaders, operating under a sort of extended period of crisis after crisis, where for the first time ever, because all of these types of crises the world has seen before, right? But never before have they co-occurred. So we've got these deep-rooted mega-trend crises. We've got climate change and aging workforce. And then for the first time ever, they're co-occurring with these acute sudden onset crises. And so what I honestly think it means for leaders and for workforces everywhere is we're feeling so much more pressure than we have ever felt before. Because we're operating such a highly interconnected world, a disruption in one end of the supply chain, exacerbates or has second and third order impacts on the other side. So as leaders, it's a completely different leadership environment. And ultimately what that means is we're probably more prone to burnout. There's some huge statistics coming out from the likes of Microsoft and the World Economic Forum about essentially 1 in 4 people now claiming self-reported rates of burnout. So finding ways personally at the core of the onion, to use the metaphor Alison used, to really maintain our personal resilience levels to really make sure that we manage our energy day to day so that we're not borrowing energy from the day ahead. I actually coined this concept. It needs to a better words, like it doesn't really roll off the tongue, but I call it the minimum viable resilience routine. Because it's all good and well that when you're operating in a better place to have all these things that we do to prepare for the day ahead and to focus on our work and to wind down and recover at the end of the day. But often, as when we put our tights and pants on, Caroline, you know, we throw that out the window and we're in the office till midnight. We're eating pizza straight from the box. We're cutting back on our sleep. We're not doing our exercise, and none of that is conducive to healthy and effective leadership. And ultimately, it's just going to exacerbate this impact and this level of disruption and pressure that we're all feeling. So every single person needs to have that personal resilience routine that they know is sustainable, even at that peak of crisis. So whether it's doing your hours-long exercise in the morning to prepare for the day ahead, or whether it's prioritizing an hour of family connection time at the end of the day after your last crisis meeting to wind down and fully recover so that your brain can switch off and you can sleep, whatever it might be, we need to start at the personal level. We can then work within our teams and with our organizations to build collective resilience. And then we can look at how we do it with the organization. From that perspective, I don't nearly have as much experience as Caroline, but what I do love, I run something called the Crisis Leadership Center. And the last 2 courses that we've run, we've had a couple of people from government attend, as well as private sector individuals, and forming those relationships and those connections. You know, I think one of the government attendees, the last course we ran, she said the key takeaway from the whole 2 days, where we throw a lot of content at them, was, I feel less alone in this world. I know someone else is out there at 3 a.m. having to run a crisis meeting. And that sense of connection is so important, I think, as we're trying to navigate this new world of pharma and poly crisis.
Wow. Thank you, Claudia. And thank you for reminding us not to borrow energy from tomorrow or from the next day. I love that. And stay with me for the last question. So my question to you is, are all crises the same? And should we lead the same way every time, considering your experience and the many crises you've dealt with? So in other words, what kinds of crisis patterns do you see? And how can leaders adapt their response to the different crises without losing their focus?
Yeah, I mean, also a huge question. I don't think all crises are the same, and therefore we don't necessarily have to lead exactly in the same way every time. This is the same reason why we as consultants don't come in and write why we write more generic crisis plans, right? Because we cannot plan for every risk, eventuality, scenario, or even failure mode. Having said that, you know, having worked on a lot of cyber attacks and ransomware responses, for example, there are huge nuances. And there's very specific challenges and decisions that leadership teams will need to make within certain specific crises that you can plan for, or that you can at least workshop, or, for lack of a better word, war game with your teams, with your leadership teams, to be more prepared for that. But you asked about patterns, because no, you can't predict what's going to happen. You can't predict what disruption will impact your organization. But we spent some time within the Crisis Leadership Center really mapping out the patterns that we do see in crisis and crisis response specifically. And typically we break down any kind of crisis into 3 phases. And the characteristics and the challenges for leadership teams in particular within each of those phases, there are some typical ones that you can pick out. So in that first phase, which is essentially the opening hours or days of the crisis, impact is going up, and uncertainty at that point is very, very high. It's often very difficult to understand what is happening, who's been impacted, what's been impacted, etc. Who do we actually need to form the response? Psychologically, stage 1, those opening hours and days, is typified, and as Alison mentioned earlier, by adrenaline. It's acute stress. Acute stress is running very, very high. What's interesting in stage 1 is stress is really helpful here, right? Because it drives action, it drives focus, it brings people together, it galvanizes us. We have this surge in energy and we get a lot done. Adrenaline and cortisol are great for that. They're great for focus. They're great for getting a lot of action tasks done. So we quite quickly try to at least put some emergency containment measures in place. That kind of typifies the transition into stage 2, where we're talking more about the days, the weeks, sometimes the months, if you look at COVID, for example, of the response. So this is where we're starting to manage the impact. We understand the situation we're dealing with, or we're starting to understand. There's fluctuations, of course, but we're starting to form situational awareness. Now, stage 2 is often, if we are still operating at that same level of stress, acute stress turns into chronic stress. And actually, that's not helpful at all. It's, acute stress can be very helpful. Chronic stress is much less helpful. In fact, it's quite harmful. It drains our psychological resources. It makes us feel stuck or incapable of changing the situation. So if we don't manage our resilience or energy levels well in the way we're just discussing, this can actually lead to burnout. Now, interestingly, stage 3 is where the organization typically returns to a new business as usual, a new operating environment. This is where we're truly recovering from the crisis. So this is often months plus. Often, psychologically, the sort of more typical outcome is post-traumatic growth or just growth. I'm not saying that we will have found everything within our crisis enjoyable as leaders, but looking back on it, often we do feel a personal sense of we took something from that, or as a team, we grew, the trust we gained, the actions we implemented, we learned a lot about ourselves. So if managed well, then actually the typical pattern we do see is that people and teams grow from that joint experience. But sort of optimizing that, I guess, comes back to everything we've been discussing today. Do we have, at a personal level, have we got our minimum viable resilience routines? Are we creating space and time to enter every crisis meeting in the right mindset, so that we're not reactive? Are we maintaining our homeostasis within our nervous system, really, so that we're operating at our best selves? As teams, like we were saying earlier, do we have that really clear shared purpose, that North Star that's bringing everyone together? Are we fostering a sense of connection and trust? So as leaders, the decisions we need to make in every single crisis will be different, and they will feel unique and challenging, and we won't feel like, oh, we can use that banked experience of the last crisis to support us here. But actually, if we're thinking about patterns of what good looks like, it does come back to those things we can put in place at the personal and at the team level to ensure that we're acting at the most personally and collectively resilient perspective.
Thank you. Wow. So basically 3 stages or 3 types when you're typifying. Yeah, interesting. I'd like to learn more with the few precious minutes that we still have left. I'd like to learn more on this from Alison and from Caroline. So maybe 2 minutes each.
Thank you. So thank you, Claudia, for that. So the thing that crossed my mind as you were speaking is that no, not all crises are the same. And I was thinking about the Johara window, the sort of known knowns, unknown knowns, the blind spot, all that. And of course, there will be things like pandemic that we know will happen again at some point, because that is the nature of it. And so that's known. But there will be things that we just are a surprise and we don't know. But I was really thinking about those crises that are really particularly apparent in our public sector services, and particularly in the NHS, and working with a number of clients within the NHS, where it's almost like that funding crisis or the tail of the COVID-19 issue with the massive waiting lists and catching up. It just feels insidious, and crisis is normal now, and they are being asked to do more with less, less money, fewer resources, less capacity, but do more. And that crisis is day to day. And I think, Claudia, to your point about chronic stress and chronic, adrenaline is not good. And the number of people I see who show up, and I look at them and I go, whoa, you're burnt out or on the cusp of burning out just because of dealing with that. And I wonder whether we need to be sort of collectively very much more aware of those sorts of crises that are happening in lots of very important organisations for us as a community and a society and individually, and how can we support people within that, because those crises aren't going to go away quickly, but the people might go away and then it'll just get worse and worse. So how can we support those people better to be more resilient and look after themselves and manage that adrenaline?
That's powerful. Crises aren't going away, but maybe people are going away. Wow. Caroline, 2 minutes.
Yeah, just quickly. Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything that's been said. And I think the challenge is, the changing landscape is this permacrisis, as Claudia said. So we're just constantly bombarded. So I think we can all feel quite overwhelmed by that. So I think being able to just almost, as a leader, to prioritize, like, what are the most important things for me to be looking at? So, because you can't deal with everything. So I think that's kind of one of the things, is being able to kind of really sort of prioritize. But I also think, interested that Alison and Claudia both mentioned chronic stresses, and I think that's a trend, that's a direction we're going in, or considering more. And it's not just on a personal level, because we're all just dealing with stuff all the time, and it's these little things that we're just dealing with, which kind of erodes away the resilience of any system, whether it's your own personal resilience or an organization's resilience, or whatever. And it's quite interesting. So the UK government has just started looking at, they have a risk register for the UK. They've just started looking at chronic risks. So things that kind of underline and reduce the kind of performance of the system. So whether it's kind of, inequality, poor health, so stuff that's sort of running along and is affecting everything and actually makes, crises worse. And so I think being able to tackle some of those things, so whether it's at that individual level of trying to kind of build the underlying kind of capacity to just be able to deal with stuff all the time, because that's the reality of the situation now. So building that internal adaptive capacity and that sort of resilience to these everyday sort of chronic stresses, and tackling some of those chronic stresses within society, I think will get us a long way, and should be part of our thinking when we're thinking about tackling crises.
Wow, great. Now, as we bring this powerful conversation to a close, I want to sincerely thank our speakers, Claudia, Caroline, and Alison, for their honesty, their wisdom, and their willingness to share not just strategies, but stories from the edge of crisis and from the heart of leadership. Today's discussion reminded us that crises are not just moments of disruption, they're also moments of deep possibility. They challenge us to lead with clarity, with courage, and above all, with humanity. To everyone who joined us today, thank you for being part of this dialogue. I hope you leave not just with ideas, but with renewed energy to lead through whatever comes next, with resilience, with purpose, and with others by your side. We look forward to continuing this important conversation in future forums. And we encourage you to join our upcoming webinar on September 10th, which will discuss building resilient leadership in young people. On October 15th, we'll discuss neuroscience behind resilient leadership. And on December 10th, we'll wrap up our 25th year at RLE with one last exciting webinar, this time on resilient leadership in the age of AI. I wish you all a good day. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.